Hello. Hi. So I'm Jess, and this is Irbe, and we're both engineers at Engineer Better. And we're here tonight to take advantage of free pizza and talk to you a little bit about Concourse Up. So to kick off, I'm sure that pretty much everyone here has some experience with Concourse, or at least knows what it is, but for the purpose of anyone that doesn't, broadly speaking, Concourse makes for easier continuous integration. It does that via pipelines. And pipelines can be configured to do any number of things. For example, this is our Concourse Up pipeline. So in the case of Concourse Up development, when a member of our team pushes code, it triggers the pipeline to run various things, including unit and system tests, before it gets to that end goal of creating a new Concourse Up release. So if the code we've pushed has broken anything further down the line, a release won't be created, and this counters that irrational fear that developers can sometimes have of pushing to master. And it also gives us visibility of any errors that might have occurred and which test or tests might have been compromised. And it means that we don't have to do all those things manually. We can automate them instead. So before Irbe speaks to you a bit about what's great about Concourse Up, it's probably useful for us to take a look at a world of deploying Concourse without Concourse Up. So broadly speaking, deploying Concourse with BOSH looks a little bit like this. So first off, you're preparing the IaaS environment. For the purpose of this talk, we're going to be focusing on AWS because that's what Concourse Up currently supports. Then you're going to deploy a new BOSH director. You're going to authenticate to that director and set up the cloud config. You'll create a deployment manifest for Concourse and deploy using BOSH. And then finally, you will create a pipeline in Concourse using the Fly CLI. So totally doable, if a little bit lengthy, before we actually get to creating a pipeline in Concourse. And if you're anything like me, when I first started, it involves getting a real head around BOSH, which feels a lot like this. So, Irbe.
Thanks, Jess. Right. Is it? Yeah. Cool. So Concourse Up is a CLI tool that deploys Concourse. It uses Terraform to configure infrastructure, deploys a BOSH director, and then uses that BOSH director to deploy Concourse and keep it running. So to use it, you would get a Concourse Up release. There's a link to our GitHub repo just on the screen. Authenticate against the cloud provider. So as Jess already mentioned, we only support AWS at the moment, although there is support for the other providers coming. And you run Concourse Up deploy. So a vanilla deployment without any options would give you a Concourse and a bunch of other integrated components, such as CredHub for secrets management and Grafana with the default usage metrics board. And then you can customize your deployment by providing options via flags, say providing your own custom domain or specifying in which region you want it deployed on AWS and so on. Why would you use it? So one of the reasons is it's faster and simpler than manual deployment. So Jess was already describing some of the steps that it would take to do it manually. So with Concourse Up, you won't have to manually configure infrastructure, and you won't have to write YAML and manually deploy BOSH. And similar, so basically, you could spend more time writing code that gives you business value instead. And similarly, with destroying Concourse Up, it can be done simply with just one command, so you won't have to go to AWS and look up manually resources and destroy them. You can just run Concourse Up destroy instead. So another reason is that it's a tested combination of components. So you can rely on us that we have already built and tested that combination of Concourse release, CredHub release, Grafana release, BOSH manifest, and so on. So this is, again, something you wouldn't have to do yourself then. And another reason is the ease of updating. So if you do have some pipelines, you'll probably want to update to a later Concourse release at some point. And with Concourse Up, you could either do it manually by downloading a latest release and running your existing deployment again so running Concourse Up deploy again on your existing deployment with a later version of Concourse Up. Or you could use a self-update feature that Concourse Up has, which would monitor our GitHub repo for a new release of Concourse Up and would attempt to deploy your deployment again with that version. So, and I'll pass it to Jess.
Cool. So now that Irbe has kind of sold you on why you'd want to use Concourse Up, let's take a closer look at it in action. So these are the three main commands that you would use with Concourse Up. We're going to take a look at the info command a little bit later. Destroy is quite self-explanatory, but first off, we're going to take a look at deploy. You'll see a little note at the top there that will say that you do need to authenticate with AWS prior to running any of those commands. Cool. So this is going to involve me going between screens a little bit. So in true cook show style fashion, here is one I made earlier. This is my deployment vanilla. And you can see that after I run that command, there are a whole bunch of things happening. Obviously, this has been speeded up for the purpose of this talk. As it stands, we find that a Concourse Up deployment takes around 15 to 20 minutes to complete. We'll be speaking a little bit more to the sequence of events happening here a little later, but at a glance, you might be able to catch some of the output, showing a number of things I mentioned on my first slide as things that would be done manually. So creating resources in the IaaS environment, deploying a director, and then finally, we should see some details for our concourse. Cool. So that's the end of our deployment. But we're going to continue the process to show you exactly how you would log into your concourse and build a really simple pipeline. Cool. So we can follow that link, and using the credentials in our output, we can log in. Great. So as Irbe mentioned earlier, all we've got in this pipeline at the moment is this, in our concourse at the moment, is this self-update pipeline. So we're going to go ahead and set a really basic, like, hello world pipeline. So using the fly CLI, which you will need to have installed to run these commands, we're just going to set the pipeline. And then we can see it exists. Great. We're going to unpause it. And then trigger that job, and that should, when it finishes, provide us with some really exciting output. Exciting and unbiased. Okay, brilliant. So before I pass back over to Irbe, she mentioned earlier that Grafana is also integrated with Concourse Up. You can access Grafana on port 3000 of your regular Concourse URL using the same username and password we just used for Concourse. So if we play this. So for the purpose of getting some metrics out of this, trigger this job a bunch more times. Cool. And then as before, we're going to use the output and those same credentials to log into Grafana. Great. And now we can have a look at our default dashboard, which gets created for Concourse. And it shows metrics for basically for everything that you can see there, CPU, memory usage, and you can get a more granular look at that if you want.
All right. Cool. So I'll talk a little bit about the info command of Concourse.
Do you want me to run it?
Yeah, maybe if you can, that'd be nice. Okay. So Concourse Up pipeline. So Concourse Up pipeline is a So as we already saw when Jess was showing the video of the deploy command, at the end it does output information about the Concourse Up deployment, such as like the Concourse login credentials and the CredHub login credentials in Grafana. But you can also get that by running the Concourse Up info command, which is basically going to show you the same creds and a bit more. So the Bosch login credentials, Concourse login credentials, CredHub Grafana, and some general information about the deployment, like in which region it's been deployed and the worker size and type and so on. Where's the next one?
Yeah, it's already on the next slide.
Cool. So another quite interesting feature that we like to use ourselves a lot is the --n flag, which is just going to give you a string of export statements with which you can then use with eval to load into your environment your Bosch credentials and CredHub credentials, which is quite handy when you want to access CredHub or Bosch. That's it.
Cool. So the example I gave earlier was of a vanilla deployment. So running Concourse Up deploy and then the deployment name. But Concourse Up also has a range of flags available that will allow you to provide a custom configuration. So the flags that we've got on screen now, they're fairly self-explanatory, but I'm just going to say a few words about each of them quickly. So by default, we deploy Concourse Up to EUS1, so that's Ireland, but you can pass an alternative region. The same with zone, so you can specify a zone within a region. Domain allows for a custom domain. The TLS cert and key is for HTTPS access. So if these aren't provided via the flag, then they will be auto-generated using Let's Encrypt. Workers default to 1, so again, this can be customized and scaled. Worker size, the type of machine used for worker VMs. Web size is the type of machine that Concourse ATC is running on. Allow IPs allows you to provide a list of whitelisted IPs. The GitHub auth client ID and secret allow you to authenticate by GitHub, and Spot by default is switched on for cost-saving purposes, but should you want to guarantee 0 downtime, you can also amend this. Tags allow you to set key value pairs for anything that is taggable on AWS. So perhaps you wanted to tag things by owner. That might be an example. And namespace allows you to give custom names to buckets.
Cool. So I'm just going to talk shortly about what happens during Concourse Up deployment, mostly what happens on AWS. So like when you run Concourse Up deploy, one of the first things it tries to do is to authenticate against the cloud provider. As we said, it's only AWS at the moment supported. So yeah, you do have to have your AWS credentials in the environment or in a creds file. So once it's done that, the next thing to do will be to create a config bucket, which is where the configuration of your deployment will be stored, as well as the state of your Bosch director, credentials for the Bosch director, and the Terraform state. So after that, it's going to run Terraform to create infrastructure that the Bosch needs. So that's going to create a VPC, public and private subnet, RDS database for the Concourse, CredHub, and UA, Bosch's Blobster bucket, a bunch of security groups, IAM users, and so on. So the next thing after that is it's actually going to deploy Bosch director, and then update cloud config, upload stem cell, and finally deploy Concourse. So, couldn't see my mouse every time.
Cool. So what's next? We've mentioned this a few times at the moment. Concourse Up only supports AWS. So in terms of what's next, this is pretty much it. So at the moment, we're working on getting Concourse Up to support deployments on GCP. And then our next task will be to do the same for Azure until we have this very harmonious situation we get on screen. Cool. So If you're interested in using Concourse Up, take a look at the repo. We have a README full of instructions on how to use the tool. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us on Slack. And thanks for listening.